Primer, Episode 2, Places, Peoples, and Cultures of Essos and the Other Continents. Part 9, The Water Dancers of Braavos. The final free city we're exploring is Volantis' chief rival, Braavos. As we discussed briefly in the Volantis section, Braavos is one of the biggest and richest cities on the entire continent, and subsequently in the entire world. It's protected by a formidable navy and is home to the Iron Bank and the House of Black and White, amongst many other famous institutions. And a few major characters like Arya Stark and Samwell Tarly spend time here too, so it's super worthwhile to investigate. Let's take a look at the map and then dive into our exploration of Braavos. First of all, it's the most northern of all these 9 free cities, sitting at the very top of the continent of Essos. The city is actually located in a lagoon and built across hundreds of tiny islands. The water of the lagoon then forms the basis for a system of canals that function as the roadways of the city. The land surrounding this lagoon is not usable farmland. It's mostly marshes and bogs, so no green fields of lush crops. Not to mention that the weather is cold, rainy, and kind of miserable. Think Scottish Highlands in the fall, when you imagine the weather or climate of Braavos. Braavos' location and climate are important factors in the story for one simple reason. Descriptions of this city make Daenerys Targaryen's origin story seem really fishy. Anyone out there who just watches the Game of Thrones TV show won't even really know what I'm talking about, and book readers might have some idea where I'm going with this. But let me explain myself to those of you who don't get what I'm trying to say, because this might end up being one of the most important details of the entire series, and could end up flipping the entire narrative on its head. Maybe. So let's start off with what we're told about Daenerys' childhood. We're told that Dany was born on Dragonstone Island, where her mom died either during or at the end of Robert's Rebellion. The books never exactly clarify when this happens. Then she and her big brother Viserys, who's only about 8 years old when Dany is born. Again, these ages are not exactly clear. He could have been 7, he could have been 9, let's just guess 8. And they get taken in, after their mother dies, by a Targaryen loyalist named Sir Willem Darry, and 4 other guys. And they all allegedly moved to Braavos. And they're supposed to have stayed in Braavos till Dany is about 3 or 4 years old, and the old knight, Sir Willem, he dies. And I don't know what happens to the other 4 men who were supposed to be there, but basically the servants steal all the wealth left to the Targaryen children and run away. Okay, so far so good. I mean, it's not great that the servants stole their wealth, but the story so far kind of makes sense. And that's all you get told in the TV show about Dany's past. And nothing about the story that you're told in the TV show seems whack or fishy. But the problem is, in the books, Dany remembers growing up in a large stone house with a red door. Her childhood home was surrounded by grassy fields that she used to run through barefoot. Her bedroom was decorated with large wooden beams that had animals carved into them, and there were lemon trees outside of her window. If you still don't get why Dany's actual memories don't line up with the story that she was raised in Braavos, then let me break it down for you further. And we'll start with the whole green fields that she used to run through as a child. Because Braavos is situated on a bunch of tiny rocky islands in a swampy lagoon, there's no way that there could have been a house built in the middle of a grassy field in that city. Remember from the TV show when Arya Stark is training with the Faceless Men in Braavos? While she's running around in that city, did any of you see a single blade of grass? My guess is no. Not that the show is always 100% accurate or anything, but I think it's safe to say that there are no grassy fields in Braavos. Now, you might argue that there are manicured lawns in the courtyards of the rich and powerful, but there are no big open fields, not even at the Sealord's palace. Plus, even if the Sealord's palace did feature a large grass field that could potentially be the one referenced in Dany's memories, the issue is that the Sealord would have never simply allowed Dany, Viserys, and their legal guardian and their whole staff to just move into a house on his property. Like, the Sealord wasn't a Targaryen, so he wasn't related to Dany and Viserys. He wasn't somehow indebted to their family or anything, so why would he allow people who would have otherwise been strangers to him to come live on his property just like that, even if they did pay a rent? That would be equivalent to the Queen of England allowing a regular everyday person to rent a nice stone cottage on the grounds of Buckingham Palace, which obviously does not happen. And furthermore, there's literally no evidence to suggest anything close to this in the books. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that against all the odds, the Sealord of Braavos allowed Dany, Viserys, and their entourage to live in a nice stone house on his property that also somehow included a large grassy field, despite the fact that it's on a rocky island. Okay, so then why did Dany and Viserys get kicked out of his house when Sir Willem died? If the Sealord was willing to let them live there in the first place, why wouldn't he just take them in as his wards once their legal guardian died? So I leave you to decide whether or not to buy into the theory that Dany and Viserys were raised on the Sealord's property, but I don't really believe in it. You could argue that Dany's house could have even been located on the outskirts of the city, like in a farming village just outside of Braavos. You know, a lot of times people say that they're from a city, like you're from Houston, but you're actually from the suburbs of Houston, or you're from Toronto, but you're actually from the suburbs of Toronto. But like I said before, there isn't any usable farmland around Braavos, so there's no way Dany's house could have been built in some farming village and surrounded by grassy fields, not if she truly lived in or around Braavos as a kid. Aside from the grassy fields, there's the issue of the lemon trees outside of Dany's bedroom window. Now this is problematic if this house is supposed to be in Braavos, because there are no lemon trees in Braavos. In fact, there are two separate exchanges, I've put the references of them up on the screen, where someone points out that lemon trees don't grow in Braavos. It's pointed out in these sections that it's too far north, it's too wet, and it's too cold to grow any sort of citrus fruit. And as I said before, it's surrounded by bogs and marshes, which don't exactly make up the kind of terrain that you'd use for a fruit orchard, especially a citrus fruit orchard. So between the grassy fields and the lemon trees, there are two really big pieces of evidence that Dany didn't grow up in Braavos as she was told all her life. The final clue is that her bedroom was adorned by carved wooden beams. Now that's something that would have been impractical and expensive in a city like Braavos. There are so few trees in this region that it's actually illegal to cut down any tree that might happen to sprout up naturally. Wood is shipped in from Qohor and beyond, making it prohibitively expensive to have wooden beams in a house. And since there's so little wood, getting a carpenter to install the beams and artistically carve animals into them would also be expensive. You'd probably have to hire someone to come in from out of town. Plus, in damp weather, we all know wood has a tendency to swell and rot, so it's not used in construction in the city. Almost everything is made of stone. And wood is especially not used as support beams holding up a house. So I guess you could argue that Dany's legal guardian, Sir Willem, just paid for wood and for the construction, but honestly, that's a lot of money to be doling out when you're on the run on essentially useless fixtures. So if you're the kind of person who keeps tabs and you're keeping tabs, then that's really three compelling reasons why Dany's whole backstory is fishy as hell. There's the grassy fields, the lemon trees, and the carved wooden beams, and these all scream that she wasn't raised in Braavos. I don't think Dany herself is lying about any of it, though. I truly think she doesn't realize that her memories of the home she grew up in and the actual reality of living in Braavos don't mesh, which is actually super weird because although she and Viserys allegedly left Braavos when Sir Willem died, she has actually been back there since his death. When she leaves Qarth and is on a ship that takes her to Slaver's Bay eventually, she does talk about traveling to Braavos with her brother and how she always enjoyed the sea because she spent the first few years of her life in Braavos. So then how does she not realize that this could not possibly be her hometown? Is it possible that Dany isn't who we think she is, or even who she thinks she is? Because she has the connection to the dragons, we know she's at least Valyrian for sure, and her looks also give that away, like dead giveaway, girl. But is she the daughter of the Mad King and Queen Rhaella? And if she didn't grow up in Braavos or one of the towns surrounding Braavos, then where did she grow up? Where was that house with the red door actually located? There are no answers to these questions, not yet anyway, and there's certainly not definitive answers. I'm sure someone out there has already proposed a theory about who Dany really is that's 100% accurate. After all, someone on Reddit did predict the whole Hodor means hold the door, so I'm sure someone's already figured this one out. But like I said, George R. R. Martin hasn't officially told us the real answer yet. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we found out that Dany isn't exactly who she thinks she is and who we as the audience are led to believe she is. Now that we've talked about the climate and location and I've told you all about the mystery surrounding Dany's childhood, let's get a little bit into the backstory of Braavos. Because while I've already mentioned that it was founded by escaped slaves from the freehold of Valyria, there's way more to that story, and it's so worthwhile to hear about it. So, the tale begins about 200 years before the 14 fires erupt and the Doom destroys Valyria. The freehold, while in a state of decay and decline, is still a superpower of the world at this point. They might have only been rivaled by the sprawling empire of Yi Ti. Maybe. We don't know that Yi Ti had magic. So, anyway, the freehold of Valyria, as you know, is upheld by magic, or was upheld by magic. And as such, the Dragon Lords were constantly on the lookout for more magical crap, for lack of a better word, to exploit. So one day, they get word that there's this continent to the south of them called Sothoryos. And it's literally full of not only magical crap, but also regular-ass riches like gemstones, exotic animal pelts, and spices. The only catch is that there seems to be a curse on Sothoryos. Like, people who go there either die from horrible diseases or they just magically disappear. For real. There's like at least one whole abandoned city hidden in the jungles of this mysterious place. This is definitely not the kind of spot that you just up and go to on a fun little mission for dope loots, cause straight up, you gonna die. Luckily for the Valyrians though, they just had hordes and hordes of slaves to throw at this problem. So they got a bunch of slaves, packed them onto boats, and sent them on an expedition to the cursed continent of Sothoryos. You know, as one does. Now, these slaves were not idiots. They had ears, duh, and they overheard the free men on the ship, like the overseers and the crew, all complaining about having to go on this cursed mission. Rumors were running rampant, people were talking about disappearances and diseases, and so the slaves, they don't really want to go to this place either. Luckily for them, they were far away from the Dragon Lords, and they knew this was the perfect opportunity for them to escape from slavery. So they secretly organized themselves, threw the Valyrian masters overboard, took control of the ships, and they were free. But now they had no idea where to go. I mean, they def times can't go to Sothoryos, because kind of F that noise. But they can't go back to Valyria either. And they can't just float around the ocean indefinitely, because they'd be like a big target for any Dragon Lord who happened to fly past. And that is where the Moonsingers come into the story. So the Moonsingers are these women that come from a place in Essos called the Plains of the Jogos Nahai, and you could think of them as oracles or seers. They have some kind of prophetic powers because they're able to predict that the only safe place for these escaped slaves to go is a secluded lagoon far to the north of the continent. They predicted that this would be the only location on the entire continent that the escaped slaves could hide where their former masters, the Dragon Lords of Valyria, couldn't find them. Because Braavos was never taken by Valyria, I guess the Moonsingers turned out to be right. Well, as you might imagine, due to the critical role that these women played in the founding of Braavos, Moonsingers to this day are held in high regard there. In fact, the Temple of the Moonsingers is the largest of all religious institutions in Braavos, just like the Temple of R'hllor is the largest in Volantis. Yo, tangent for a sec though, Braavos, while founded by people who were escaping Valyria, has a lot in common with other free cities that were actually founded by Valyria as colonies. And you'd think that since they were enslaved by the Valyrians, they'd be against anything remotely Valyrian, but they do in fact share many aspects of Valyrian culture with the other free cities. For example, they all speak a form of bastardized High Valyrian. And just like all of the other free cities except for the theocracies of Norvos and Qohor, Braavos appears to be a religiously pluralistic society where you can find temples of every major religion and the citizens are allowed to freely practice whatever faith they want. Anyway, back to the story of the founding of Braavos. Eventually, the escaped slaves developed a real city in the lagoon, and they did it by being sneaky about their location and smart with money. In order to make sure that the Dragon Lords of Valyria never found them, the citizens of the brand new city of Braavos would do business with outsiders on boats. They were like if the store came to your house instead of you going to the store. These early Braavosi traders never even told their customers the name of the city that they came from or that they even lived in a city. So what did these traders sell exactly? There were precious few natural resources in this lagoon, being as it was surrounded by bogs and stuff. So how did a bunch of slaves in this backwater lagoon make themselves stupid wealthy to the point that Braavos is now one of the richest cities in the whole fantasy world? Well, the answer is pearls and purple dye. I mean, they had a crap load of oysters lying around, and just like the city of Tyrosh that we talked about before, they had all these snails on their rocky little islands that could produce a bunch of different dye colors. Although purple is the most common and the most famous. Okay, I realize that saying the Braavosi economy is based off of just two things is a gross oversimplification because they also had fresh seafood, they also could get peat from the bogs for heating, and they could also hire themselves out as tradesmen and mercenaries amongst other things. After all, just because they were former slaves doesn't mean that they weren't trained with skills like masonry and blacksmithing. So they had more than just fancy cloth and jewelry to sell to turn a tidy profit, but the pearls of Braavos and the purple dye are probably the most famous of their exports. Now let's talk about one of the most important events in the history of Braavos, the uncloaking. That was the moment in history when Braavos revealed its very existence to the rest of the world. So, the World Encyclopedia, World of Ice and Fire, claims that the existence of Braavos was revealed to the world on the 111th anniversary of the city's founding by a man named Uther, who was the Sealord of Braavos at the time. Some of this information is also given to Arya Stark when she's training with the Faceless Men. Thing is, despite telling the world that Braavos existed, the people of the city chose to keep their actual location a secret for another 200 years. So for 200 years, people in the world were aware that Braavos was a thing, but they had no idea where it actually was, and outsiders still couldn't go there. Anyway, the events of announcing their existence to the world was eventually turned into a holiday for the city, and that's what the uncloaking is in the current story. It's a celebration that takes place over 10 days every year in Braavos to celebrate the city's coming out to the world. Everyone parties for like a week and a half, and on the final day, they throw a giant masquerade ball. At midnight, all the partygoers take off their masks, and the huge statue that stands in the harbor, the Titan of Braavos, is said to roar. It sounds to me a lot like the Carnival of Venice. So if you need like a real-world counterpart for this event, I would say the Carnival of Venice. As time went on, Braavos opened its doors to the world, and it flourished. During the Century of Blood following the Doom of Valyria, Braavos fought against the city of Volantis when it started trying to conquer the other free cities and make a new Valyrian freehold, but like minus the dragons. In more recent times, they fought against Pentos in 6 different wars to abolish slavery in that city and establish dominance over the western coast of Essos. They've even fought against Aegon's conquest of Westeros by sending their warships to help the Vale stand against the Targaryens and their allies. But enough about who the Braavosi fought. Let's talk about some of the institutions and organizations that call this city home. We've already talked about the Temple of the Moonsingers, and I've mentioned the Office of the Sealord quite a few times now. I'll be explaining all about the Sealord in a hot minute, but right now let's focus on the 2 Braavosi institutions that all show watchers will recognize. That's the Iron Bank of Braavos and the House of Black and White, home of the infamous assassins, the Faceless Men. We'll be talking all about the Iron Bank in just a few minutes, but for right now, let's discuss the Faceless Men. So, who are they? What are they all about? And where do they come from? Well, you guys already know some of the basics. The Faceless Men change their appearance using some kind of magic that involves cutting off the faces of dead people and then wearing them. They go around killing people who they're paid to kill, and hiring them can be super pricey, depending on who you want killed. The House of Black and White is the headquarters of the Faceless Men, and it's where they train their future assassins. But it's not just their home base, it's also the temple of the many-faced god. To get a better understanding of this deity, let's unpack the origin story of the Faceless Men who worship it. It all started in Valyria. Now you guys might be seeing a pattern here with the Free Cities. Everything starts in Valyria. Anyway, so possibly hundreds of years before the Doom and long before the founding of the city of Braavos, there was an enslaved man who worked in the mines under the volcanoes. So remember, the 14 fires on which the massive city of Valyria was built are actually 14 active volcanoes that ring the Valyrian Peninsula. So this man and his fellow volcano mining slaves are living and working in conditions that are just undoubtedly brutal, as you might imagine. Over time, this man overhears the prayers of his co-slaves, begging their various gods for death as a release from this almost literal hellhole that they're forced to live and work in. The guy who overhears these prayers starts thinking to himself that all the gods are actually just one god, that aspects of this god show up in various religions around the world. This god is basically death, but he names it the many-faced god, and he decides that he's been chosen by this death god to be its instrument on Earth or on Planetos. So he goes to the most desperate of all the slaves and offers them the very first gift of the many-faced god, which is a fancy way of saying he killed the other slave. Soon, other slaves heard about this and also begged for the gift of the many-faced god. And somehow, that one dude was joined by others and the organization was born. I guess eventually the group of euthanizers wound up in Braavos and decided that it would be the perfect location to set up shop. And that's how the Faceless Men got started and how they ended up with the House of Black and White. Now, how they ever learned to cut the faces off a corpse and wear it like a costume, I can't say. The books don't tell you, and honestly, it doesn't really probably have to ever be explained. We can talk about theories about the Faceless Men in later episodes, but for now, all you need to know is that they did somehow learn to use this kind of magic to become these shape-shifting assassins. So now that we've covered the founding of Braavos, the Moonsingers, and the Faceless Men, let's get into the Iron Bank of Braavos. Okay, you guys, I'll make a confession. This maybe is going to be the most boring, but also potentially incredibly important aspects of the story going forward. You can see the Iron Bank is super powerful and totally has the ability to screw everything up for both our heroes and our villains. And y'all, there's plotting afoot. So, as promised, I'm about to explain medieval banking and its impact on our fantasy world, because I'm a secret, okay, not so secret, history nerd. Lego. Now, to most book readers and show watchers, an institution like the Iron Bank might be easily dismissed. I mean, it's a bank for God's sake. Like, what could possibly be exciting about it? Now, another thing people sometimes take for granted is how exactly did banking work in the olden-timey days? I mean, you clearly couldn't just use an ATM or a debit card. So how did banks from that kind of time period function anyway? And is any of that important to the story at hand? Let's start this conversation with the whole how exactly did olden-timey banks work anyway question. Banks actually existed as far back as the time of ancient Greece. So, like in the same time period as the movie 300, we knew major cities in that time period had banks. But those banks were very different than what we have today. See, back then, the bank was usually located in either a temple or like a government building like a Senate building. Your average Joe Schmo ancient Greek dude, let's say he's got like 100 gold coins, but he wants to save half of them for later. Now, Homeboy's little farm is dope and everything, but it's not exactly a fortified structure. So if some bad guy wants to come into his home and take his money, they probably easily could. So it made sense for people of that day to have a secured, protected location where they could store their valuables and be assured that they'd be safe. And that's where the city's temples come into play. Now, Joe Schmo takes his money to the temple and stores it there. The priests give Joe Schmo a token of some kind to say what he stored, or perhaps he gives Joe Schmo a key to a personal vault. Later, when Joe Schmo wants to withdraw his money from the bank, he has to go back to the exact same building that he made his deposit in. So, if he made his deposit in the Temple of Apollo in Athens, then he can't get his stuff back from any old temple. It has to be the Temple of Apollo in Athens. He can't be showing up to the Temple of Athena in Sparta or Thebes or whatever and expect that they'll let him take out those gold coins. Now, all my Harry Potter nerds out there are gonna know what this institution is like. It's a little like Gringotts Bank in Harry Potter. There's only one location, and you have to physically go to that same building to both deposit and later withdraw your treasures using a key to unlock your personal vault. In every major city in Westeros, this is pretty much how banks operate. The largest banks on that continent are actually septs of the Faith of the Seven, and not only do they provide deposit and withdrawal services, they also occasionally lend money. In fact, the royal family owes millions of gold coins to the Faith of the Seven. In the books, it's one of the reasons that Cersei Lannister allows the High Sparrow to reinstate the Faith militant. On the show, they make it seem like the only reason Cersei did that was so she could get the Faith to destroy the Tyrell family. But it wasn't the only reason in the books. Like, she was petty, but not just petty. The Iron Bank of Braavos is totally different. Well, it's not exactly totally different. See, just like ancient banks and banks all over the rest of Planetos, there's only one location of the Iron Bank, and that's the giant building in Braavos. The difference is the bankers can come to you. So basically, throughout the books of Feast of Crows and A Dance with Dragons, there are these three ships, a cog, a galleass, and a galley, that take the banker Tycho Nestoris across Westeros, where he has meetings with various noble lords. Book readers only get to see Tycho's interactions with Stannis Baratheon and Jon Snow, but his three ships are spotted in White Harbor and Maidenpool, where presumably the banker was visiting with the Manderleys and the Tarleys. Why is that important? Well, because the Iron Bank does so much more than just deposit, withdrawal, and loan money. In fact, the Iron Bank is arguably one of the most powerful organizations in the world, and almost certainly more powerful than the Iron Throne. How did it get that way? Well, I'm glad you asked. Now, the answer to that question is actually pretty complex, so let's start by first looking at the founding of the Iron Bank in order to simplify it. So sometime after that group of escaped slaves founded the city of Braavos, 23 of them, 16 men and 7 women, began hiding their loot in an abandoned iron mine. Over time, they built a bank on top of the iron mine to put all that money that they stored to good use. Now, some of you out there must be asking, how exactly does building a bank make anyone earn any money? Well, there's a lot of ways, actually. Well, for starters, the bank could loan money to someone to open up a small business. Now, let's say that there's a stonemason and he wants to buy his tools. The tools cost about 10 gold coins, but homie doesn't have enough to buy them, and without those tools, he can't do his job and earn money. He could go to the Iron Bank and plead his case to a banker, just like we see Stannis Baratheon and Davos Seaworth doing in episode 6 of season 4 of Game of Thrones. So our stonemason talks to the bankers and says, "Look guys, I'm a dope stonemason. We live in a city made of stone, and so I'll always have work and money coming in. If you lend me 10 gold coins, I'll pay you back 15 gold coins over the course of the next 3 years." The bankers agree, and at the end of those 3 years, they have more money than when they started out. And that's how it goes with the Iron Bank. at least on the small scale. So aside from helping fishermen, tradesmen, and regular everyday Braavosi people, the Iron Bank also provides its loan services to people all over the world, and they do so by using boats, almost like a floating bank branch, and they launch their boats from the bank's private harbor, the Purple Harbor. And it's named that because most of the boats have sails or hulls that are painted purple. Pretty much every noble house in Westeros has dealt with the Iron Bank at some point in time. In fact, the crown itself, the almighty Iron Throne of Westeros, owes millions of gold coins to the Iron Bank, in addition to the millions that they owe the Faith. So when the Iron Bank loans money to powerful people, that money usually goes to funding massive building projects or paying for war. In other words, the Iron Bank agreeing to loan you money pretty much has the power to make or break a kingdom. And if you're still confused as to how they do that, let's discuss what happens when you don't pay the Iron Bank back. Let's go back to that example of the stonemason. So if in the 3 years' time he hasn't paid the 15 gold coins that he promised to pay the bank will send its hired goons to go to his house, take back his mason tools, grab whatever gold coins they can find in his house, and maybe like break his legs or something. It's all very mafia-like. And the stonemason ends up worse off than when he started. Okay, so that's what happens to a regular dude who fails to pay back his debts to the Iron Bank. What happens when cities, kingdoms, or nobles fail to pay back their debts? Well, that is where the Iron Bank begins engaging in speculation and war profiteering, and that's how they got so powerful. So let's think on the big scale for a second. Let's say, for example, there is a noble dude who wants to be king, and let's say that dude has a pretty good claim to the throne, and he's got an army of guys who are willing to fight for him to take the crown away from the guy who is currently king. But our dude's army has like too few soldiers, crappy swords, and not enough horses. So the wannabe king would go to the Iron Bank and try to convince them that loaning him money is a super smart idea. He will not only pay that money back with interest, but he'll pay off any debt that the other guy who's still the actual king has racked up. The banker dudes think about it for a second. The current king that's on the throne, he's kind of an unstable douchebag. He owes a buttload of money to the bank, and he's taking his sweet-ass time paying it back, to the point where the Iron Bank is now worried that he might never pay them back. The bankers decide that since the current king doesn't seem like he's going to honor his debts, and he seems a little cray-cray, they're going to back the wannabe king instead. The Iron Bank gives the wannabe king his mad fat loots, like let's say 1 million gold coins, and the wannabe king goes and hires like whole armies of mercenaries. He buys fancy weapon and armor, gets like the sweetest horses, like all that good stuff. Then he goes off to fight the existing king. Uh-oh, what's this? The wannabe king loses the war? Crap, what happens now? What will the Iron Bank do? At this point, you can see from the images in front of you that the story I'm telling you here isn't just something I pulled out of my ass. This is actually the tale of wannabe king Stannis Baratheon and the current Lannister dynasty on the Iron Throne. In the HBO TV show, Stannis Baratheon is out of the story because he's dead already. But in the books, Stannis the Manus is very much alive and he hasn't killed his daughter Shireen yet. But he isn't exactly winning the war either, and he did borrow a crapload of money from the Iron Bank. Not to mention that the debt that the Iron Throne owes the Iron Bank still isn't paid. So for those of you who don't remember or don't know, Robert Baratheon, arguably with a lot of help from a swindling Littlefinger, who was his master of coins, managed to get the crown into millions of gold in debt, and his alleged sons, Joffrey and Tommen, aren't much better. Things got a little bit better when Tyrion was in charge of King's Landing, and then when Margaery, Lady Olenna, and the Tyrells showed up on the scene. But even with Tyrion's careful management and the aid of the Tyrells' vast fortune, the Iron Throne is still in trouble, and that's because Cersei Lannister is now in charge of the Seven Kingdoms. So in the show, Tommen is dead and Cersei rules as queen in her own right. In the books, Tommen is still alive, but because he's very much younger than he is on the TV show, like he's a kid, Cersei runs the show, not him. And despite Maester Pycelle's warning, because he's still alive in the books, The Iron Bank always collects its due, and Cersei in the books has decided she doesn't have to pay the Iron Bank back until she feels like it. Now, I know in the show she totally just did the damn thing, stole the Tyrell fortune to pay back the Iron Bank, but think back to the scene beforehand where the banker Tycho Nestoris visits Cersei in King's Landing. Their conversation about the Iron Bank's bet on who will win the Iron Throne is exactly what I mean when I say that the Iron Bank engages in speculation and war profiteering. Oh, side note, because I'm super nitpicky like that, in the show, Cersei tells Tycho not to support Daenerys because Daenerys took out the slave trade in Slaver's Bay, and the Iron Bank had invested in the slave trade. Now, see, that seems out of character for the Iron Bank simply because they were founded by former slaves and are based out of a city that fought 5 different wars with Pentos just to eradicate slavery. Well, not just to eradicate slavery, but it was a huge part of what they were all about, so I really doubt that the Iron Bank would have invested in slavery. But pretty much every other point that Cersei made in the show in that conversation about how revolutionaries tend not to be good at paying debts still applies to the situation. I mean, she had said a Lannister always pays his or her debts, and then she did that. By the way, damn, R.I.P. Lady Olenna, the queen of reading a bitch for filth. Now, both Stannis and Cersei owe the Iron Bank ridiculous sums of money. Neither is paying it back, and neither is even really in a position to pay it back. Now that's going to bite them in the ass, and my guess is very soon. See, in response to this, the Iron Bank has issued that all debts must be collected across Westeros immediately, and all new lending has shut down. Now this might not seem that important to you, but let me explain how this has begun to throw the whole of Westeros into an economic recession and is causing chaos across the 7 kingdoms. There are more noble families in Westeros who are secretly in debt to the Iron Bank than would ever care to admit to the public. So families like the Manderleys of the North, and even our buddy Samwell's family, the Tarleys of the Reach, are all just pretending to be rich when in reality they're pretty bankrupt. They owe tons of gold to the Iron Bank, and all this warfare has only made it more difficult to pay that money back. So what makes the situation worse is that they need to be able to keep up the payments on everyday things in their regions that they govern. So for example, the Starks in the North, they have to make sure that they can not only keep up their own castles' repair and maintenance, they also have to be able to provide for the repair and maintenance on any castles belonging to any major families in the North. And each noble family is responsible for not only keeping their own property up, but they also have to provide for the common people who live in the towns and villages that they rule over. So a family like the Manderleys needs to be able to pay for the repairs not only to their own castle, but also to the town of White Harbor and their massive trading port. Now, that there's a war going on, though, that would be the ongoing War of the 5 Kings, by the way. These cash-strapped nobles also have to pay for weapons, armor, horses, and basically provisions for an entire army. So if the Iron Bank suddenly asked them to pay all their debts back, and then said that they couldn't borrow any more money, these families and then the regions that they controlled would be economically devastated. It would be like the medieval fantasy equivalent to the Great Depression. And this financial disaster is about to go down all over Westeros in the next couple of books. In the books, since Stannis is still alive, it seems like the Iron Bank is still trying to back his claim to the Iron Throne. So eventually they hope to pit Cersei and the Lannister army against Stannis and his forces. Because the Manderleys, Tarleys, and other families owe the Iron Bank, they will most likely be forced to betray Cersei if she continues not paying off the crown's debts. Now, I'm not sure if in the books Cersei and Stannis will actually get to fighting. I mean, plot-wise, we're a pretty long ways away from that. I'm just saying that on the surface, that seems to be the goal of the Iron Bank. Okay, so that whole foray into medieval banking and all that stuff might have been a long, boring trip for you, and for that, I apologize. Let's move on to discuss more on the city of Braavos. I want to discuss the people of Braavos in particular, with a focus on the Sealord of Braavos, the key holders, the Braavos, and the Courtesans. Starting with the ruler of the city, which is the Sealord of Braavos. So this is actually an elected office that's held for life once the person's elected, and just like most of the other free cities, the people electing this leader are a council of city magisters. But unlike the other cities, another group of people have the right to vote in this very limited election, and those peoples are the key holders. I'll explain all about the key holders in just a sec, but for now let's continue dishing the hot gossip on the Sealord. So the Sealords, like every person who holds the title of Sealord, live in this place called the Sealord's Palace, and everyone is protected by a bodyguard called the First Sword of Braavos. In both the books and the show, the former First Sword of Braavos is a character we've all met, and I'm pretty sure the consensus is we all loved him. And that would of course be Syrio Forel, Arya's first sword training instructor. In the books, he told Arya all these stories about what it was like to be the old Sealord's first sword, and what the palace was like, including this awesome description of the zoo that the Sealord has on his property. The animals that Syrio describes are, clearly one of them is zebras, one of them is giraffes. Then he describes something called a giant hairy pig rat the size of a cow. He also goes on to describe a tiger that carries its babies in a pouch like a freaking kangaroo. And then something that pretty much sounds like it's a dinosaur. He called it a giant lizard with scythes for claws. And that sounds to me like a mix between like a T-Rex and a velociraptor. So that's gonna haunt my nightmares. Thanks, Syrio. Just kidding. And I know that was a lot of seemingly frivolous information, but that's pretty much all the cool and interesting stuff about the Sealord. Like, he clearly does more than just float around on his barge and chill with the First Sword and collect crazy animals. But the stuff that he gets up to is the typical dude in charge type of stuff. He makes laws, he conducts council meetings, he, all that kind of leadership stuff. Fill in the blanks yourself. Either way, it's not very different from the stuff that other rulers of the free cities get up to, so it's not really worth mentioning. Anyway, let's talk about the key holders now. I've mentioned that they have enough clout in Braavos to be involved in electing new Sealords, but who are they? Well, these dudes are the descendants of the original 23 slaves who started the Iron Bank. The name comes from the fact that the original vaults could only be opened with these 23 special keys, and so to this day the key holders wear ceremonial keys on fancy occasions. The key holders are basically the kind of rich people who, if they were living in America today, they would be all like, my ancestors came here on the Mayflower. Like, think about the Rothschilds, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, and like the Rockefellers. Like, real sons and daughters of the American Revolution, secret society of the skulls type of ish. You know what I'm talking about? Like, all my Gilmore Girls fans out there watching this will know exactly the type of extra fancy, straight bougie, Emily Gilmore biz that I'm referring to here. But yeah, that's what the key holders are kind of all about. The next group of people that we'll be looking at are the Braavos, not to be mistaken with the name of the city. I'm saying the word Bravo as in like bravo, encore. Now, these guys, they usually go around in pairs, and they challenge men, to duels, and they sword fight for fun, and sometimes profit. So, they challenge people to duels late at night, and any man who happens to be wearing a sword who's visiting the city can be challenged by a Braavo. Now, many of these duels take place on a pool of water near the Sealord's palace known as the Moon Pool. These guys practice this form of sword fighting that we would maybe say today is fencing, but they call it water dancing. It's said that most skilled Braavos can kill a man on a pool of water and never disturb the surface of the water. Now, I want to pause here and take a second to make a potential connection between this water dancing culture in Braavos and the famed water-based magic culture of the Rhoynar people. Now, the culture of the Rhoynar is coming up in the next couple of videos, so I'm not going to get into the full details here right now, but the people who lived along the Rhoyne River during the time of the Valyrian freehold were called the Rhoynar. They worshipped the river that they lived on and called it Mother Rhoyne. It's said that the princes and princesses possessed strange magical powers. They had water wizards and witches who used giant funnels of water to fight against the dragon fire of their Valyrian conquerors. But in the end, the freehold and its dragons won the day over the Rhoynar people, and those who weren't slaughtered in the final great war between these two civilizations were taken as slaves back to the Valyrian Peninsula. So the thing about slavery is that it tries very hard to dehumanize slaves and strip them of who they are. And it's basically how the institution can perpetuate itself. The slave owner is constantly trying to take the slave's culture, language, and identity away from them. But those things somehow survive in like a new form. And we can see examples of that in our real world today. So Black people who are descended from African slaves have managed to retain slices of this home culture of Africa and infused it with the Western culture that they were forced into, and somehow managed to create the backbone of what is today modern American culture. And I think that's probably the same thing that happened with the Rhoynar. So these guys get taken as slaves back to Valyria. That's about 1,000 years before the events of Game of Thrones. And then they're slaves for about 700 years. And then 300 or so years before the events of Game of Thrones, a diverse group of escaped slaves establishes the city of Braavos. Now, these slaves would have been descendants of practically every race of people on Planetos. We know that must be true because the Moonsingers, the ones who found the original safe location for the city to be set up, were from all the way over here, which is the plains of the Jogos Nohai. So we know that the survivors of the last Rhoynish War were made into slaves as well. So it's not unbelievable to imagine that there are descendants of those original Rhoynar slaves amongst the escaped slaves that found the city of Braavos. It's also not unbelievable to imagine that once they were free of the Valyrian masters, they spent some time developing a unique culture based on the snippets of old Rhoynish culture that might have been passed down from generations of other Rhoynish people in slavery over the course of about 700 years. I'm going to make one more connection that kind of is maybe a little bit tenuous of a connection, but I think it actually speaks to the idea that water dancing is something that is descended from the Rhoynar tradition. And that is by comparing the way that Syrio Forel, the first sword of Braavos, who is a known water dancer, how he fights and his fighting style with that of Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper. So we know that the Martells are definitely descendants of the Rhoynar. After all, their ancestor Mors Martell married Princess Nymeria, the last princess of the Rhoynar, and their two cultures merged, which is why the people in Dorne to this day have, well, at least some of them have darker skin and they have accents and they look just generally very different from the people in the rest of Westeros. They practice a form of sword fighting and of combat that is kind of very big flourishes and the kind of techniques that we see Syrio doing on the show. You can see it more clearly between the fight with the Red Viper and the Mountain, and then the other, anytime you see Syrio Forel training Arya, you can see for yourself that there are very big similarities between the way that these two fighters move. And I believe it's because their technique, their fighting technique, is descended from, in some way, from the from the Rhoynar tradition. Moving on, let's talk about the courtesans of Braavos. Now, I'm going to make a distinction here between courtesans and your average prostitute in a brothel. A courtesan would be more high class, they cost more money, and they generally do more than just have sex with their clients. They also operate relatively independently, so they don't answer to like pimps or madams. A working age courtesan of Braavos would most likely live on her own floating barge and usually is rich enough to afford to keep a couple of servants on the barge to take care of her needs. Oh, and it should be noted that these courtesans of Braavos are world famous. Like their slave counterparts in cities like Lys and Volantis, they're highly trained in many forms of pleasure. Also, many of them play musical instruments or have nice singing voices, and this is incredibly important in a city like Braavos, as Braavosi culture is deeply rooted with music and art and stuff like that, but music especially. So the courtesans of Braavos are also the biggest fashionistas of their city, of their society. Dressmakers, jewelry makers, and people like that literally beg the most famous or renowned courtesans to wear their clothes and accessories because they know the rest of the women of the city will copy the courtesans. So these elite sex workers tend to get incredible fashions for free as a trade-off for basically advertising for these craftsmen. When these elite courtesans retire from sex work, They tend to open brothels, bars, or taverns, and given how these women have spent their careers as entrepreneurs, they tend to make fantastic business owners in retirement. All over the city, there are places like the Cattery, the Satin Palace, and the Happy Port that all seem to be brothels that are run by women. Side note, the woman who runs the Happy Port brothel, her name is Marilyn, and she claims she has the biggest tits in Braavos. I know that's a weird fact for me to be bringing up, but that rather vivid description, plus the way that she talks, like the way that George R. R. Martin has written her dialogue, I mean, you guys, it's like she's the Game of Thrones version of Big Ange. Yo, rest in peace, Big Ange. Okay, remember how I said before how one of the major exports of Braavos were their pearls and how the courtesans were like world famous? Well, one of the most famous courtesans of all Braavos is called the Black Pearl of Braavos, and she's actually super interesting. So, long ago, about 125 years before the start of our story, there was this Targaryen king on the Iron Throne in Westeros named Aegon IV. He was also called Aegon the Unworthy. He was a lot like Robert Baratheon or like the real-life King Henry VIII of England. He was greedy, gluttonous, and most of all, he loved ladies. And it seemed that the ladies loved cool Aegon right back. So this guy, he had like 9 famous mistresses from around the world over the course of his lifetime. And one of these women was this gorgeous black woman, this pirate queen called Belger Othero, also known as the Black Pearl of Braavos. So King Aegon and Belger, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, I think it's called Belger, they had 3 children. One of their daughters, Bellanora, became a famous courtesan known for her great beauty. She eventually gained the title Black Pearl after her mother died. So when Bellanora went on to have a daughter of her own, that daughter also became a courtesan, and thus the title of Black Pearl has passed on from mother to daughter over the generations. The current Black Pearl is said to be so beautiful that lanterns seem dimmer compared to her. Interesting factoid, if the Black Pearl really is the descendant of Aegon the Unworthy, then that means she's part Targaryen, or she's part Valyrian. Either way, she could potentially be able to ride a dragon. Not that this will happen in the books, but it's just an interesting thing to note. Also, the reason I said if she's really Aegon's descendant was because the original Black Pearl, the one who was a pirate queen, was said to have a husband in every port, so it's possible that she got pregnant from someone else who wasn't Aegon, but whatevs. That was just another one of my infamous tangents. I doubt we're ever going to see the Black Pearl of Braavos on the back of one of Daenerys' dragons. Don't imagine that's going to happen. So that's the basic rundown of the important figures of Braavosi society. What about everyday Braavosi people? What were they like? Well, we know that they love a good song, and we know that they love to see the latest plays at one of the many theaters that dot the city. They do wear a lot of blue, purple, and gray. They love pearls. They eat tons of seafood. They seem to have a competitive market for fashion and a bustling economy in general. Oh, and they love floating around on barges and visiting with their world-famous courtesans. So actually, all in all, they seem like a pretty fun-loving people. So, what real-life city was our author George R. R. Martin inspired by when he thought up Braavos? Let's explore and see if we can suss it out. Right away, there are 2 distinct possibilities that come to mind when I imagine what real-life city Braavos is based on, and those 2 cities are Venice in Italy and Amsterdam in the Netherlands. When I was doing my research for this episode, I tried to do as accurate a comparison of these 2 cities as I could, given that I went to school for computer science and not history. But the thing is, I didn't end up coming to a definite conclusion as to which of these 2 cities is more like Braavos. In fact, I really racked my brain on this one, and I've decided to let you guys decide for yourselves. I'm just going to present the information. So for starters, let's look at geography. Braavos is set in a lagoon and built across hundreds of tiny islands. Venice is located in the Venetian lagoon and situated across 117 islands. Amsterdam is not in a lagoon, and the islands are mostly man-made. Bogs and marshes surround both cities, although Amsterdam has a man-made forest next to it. Now let's look at the climate. Venice, while in the northern end of Italy, is actually pretty far south in terms of where it lays on the globe, so it's pretty sunny and hot. Amsterdam, on the other hand, is located in northern Europe, right here in the Netherlands. The climate there is rainy, cloudy, and cold. Braavos' major holiday is the uncloaking, which culminates in a big masquerade ball, and the whole affair sounds an awful lot like the Carnival of Venice. Braavosi people love to wear darker colors, and they love pearls. The olden-timey people of Amsterdam also wore the same colors and loved pearls too. In terms of food, the people of Amsterdam enjoy some staple seafood dishes, but that's nothing in comparison to the wide range of seafood-based dishes found in Venice, making that another way in which the Italian city is more like Braavos than the Dutch one. Both real-world cities are known for their love of the arts, especially theater and music, just like the fantasy city of Braavos. And just like that fantasy city, our two potential real-life inspiration cities have always been famous for brothels and sex work for as far back as the Middle Ages in some cases. To this day, Amsterdam is world famous for its notorious red light district, and the historical courtesans of Venice were known for being both fashionistas and important members of society, working with the richest and most powerful men in their city. Finally, both Venice and Amsterdam were famous centers of banking and commerce and remain that way to this day. With all that said, it seems like a pretty even split between these two cities as to which one is more like Braavos. And because of that, I'm going to say that maybe George R. R. Martin was actually inspired by both cities, and that's why you can see influences from both Venice and Amsterdam in the fantasy city of Braavos that he created. And with that, we've finally concluded our exploration of the 9 free cities of Essos. However, these so-called Daughters of Valyria were only the tip of the iceberg in terms of our overall journey across the continent of Essos. And if you thought that the human sacrifice in Qohor, or dancing bears of Norvos, or the sky-high chariot racing of Volantis were exciting, well baby, you ain't seen nothing yet. Let me make it clear, the free cities are more civilized and tame than the rest of this giant continent, and we're about to get into some high fantasy, magical craziness, even some Lovecraftian territory. Up next, we looked at the mother of all free cities, the ancient and glorious, but ultimately doomed Freehold of Valyria.